Alright, third video, talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. And just a reminder to where they originate from. Remember, it's called the craniosacral pathway, so cranium and the sacrum. And when they say cranium, what they're really talking about is there are specific, basically what's called visceral efferent nuclei that are located in the brainstem. And hopefully you're memorized this by now, but it's 3, 7, 9, and 10. So here's 3, something called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and this is something, or this is what is causing pupillary constriction. The cranial nerve 7 is the part of the facial nerve, and a big, one of the main functions is this via the superior salivatory nucleus, which causes superior salivation, right? And then cranial nerve 9, which is glossopharyngeal, causes inferior salivation. And there is 10. So, and a lot of this comes from, a lot of the information from 10 comes from the dorsal vagal nucleus, I believe. And you guys should have heard of the vagus nerve. I think in the visceral organs, it's out of all the innervation of the visceral organs, the vagus provides 70%. So does a ton of stuff. There are even some studies that show something called vagal nerve stimulation, or VNS, has cured all kinds of stuff, from like autoimmune diseases to even some types of cancer in animal models, reduced pain significantly. So there's a lot of researchers that are really excited about vagal nerve stimulation. There are actually electrical simulators that you can implant surgically that lie right next to the blood vessels the nerves run with, and provide a stimulation every morning to these patients. It's pretty cool stuff. That'd be an example of, instead of altering the chemical signal that we often do in pharmacology, I think this is kind of the future, because it helps augment the electrical signal. Because remember, in the nervous system, you always have an electrical signal that's converted to a chemical signal, converted back to an electrical signal. And pharmacologically, we've only been focusing on this neurotransmitter stuff, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests augmenting electrical signals can be very helpful in treating patients with all kinds of stuff. So that's, what was I talking about? Okay, yeah, then sacral, S2 through S4, and that's where you get a lot of your digest function, as well as your, your point. So this is like maintaining erections, also initiating urination in the bladder, and I think that's all I want to talk about here. Oh, here it is, 75%. What is that? Oh, sorry about that. I'll have to fix that later. Okay, so this is another table similar to the parasympathetic lecture. And remember, everything's the opposite. Okay, so, and anything that it activates one thing, the other system will inhibit that same thing, right? So parasympathetic nervous system increases motility and peristalsis. So if you know that, you don't even need to memorize that the sympathetic nervous system decreases motility. Anytime you're talking about parasympathetic activity, it's almost always going to be muscarinic receptors. And I want you guys to know the subpopulation in different target organs again. M2 is famous because it's in the heart. And like I said, you don't even need to memorize the stuff because you know that sympathetic is going to increase heart rate always. So parasympathetic activity will decrease it. The only difference is the effector molecule is acetylcholine, and it binds to M2 muscarinic receptors, whereas in the sympathetic nervous system, the effector molecule, I'll put sympathetic here, was norepinephrine, and it bound to beta-1 adrenergic receptors. So vascular smooth muscle, this is what I was talking about. There's really no parasympathetic tone on vascular smooth muscle in the blood vessels, leaving it largely up to direct sympathetic control. And there's a lot of indirect mechanisms that can counterbalance the sympathetic nervous system so you don't end up having massive vasoconstriction and increase in blood pressure and all that stuff. But we'll talk about that later. The GI tract, just talked about that. That's M3 receptors. Bronchioles, since the sympathetic nervous system causes bronchodilation, parasympathetic causes bronchoconstriction. And to keep with the example of asthma, the first line was like albuterol. The second line treatment is anti-muscarinics. Anti-muscarinics, also called anticholinergics, and they are antagonists to muscarinic receptors. So if you block muscarinic receptors, you prevent constriction and you allow for dilation, bronchodilation. And that would be helpful in an asthma patient, right? Because they're having lots of bronchoconstriction. I talked about earlier, this is the point, initiating and maintaining erection. Bladder is also M3, similar to the GI tract here and bronchioles. And this is basically allows you to urinate, contracts the bladder wall, and relaxes the sphincter. And this is a pathway that's, like a lot of these, started up in the hypothalamus, I believe. Sweat glands, none. Remember, sweat glands are one of the things that are only innervated by sympathetic activity. And in the eye, it causes pupil constriction. And get familiar, you might already be familiar with these terms, but meiosis is pupil constriction, and mydriasis is pupil dilation. So big pupil, small pupil. And I always had trouble remembering that, so just remember D, the mydriasis. Spell it with a big D and you'll remember it's pupil dilation. So I'll put an S so you don't get confused, sympathetic. And also, parasympathetic activity allows for near vision. So the classic example is reading, or anything that starts far away in your vision and then comes up close. If you take your hand, hold your arm out, and then bring it up to your eyes, that's accommodation, and that's these two go together. And you'll see in a lot of pathologies, like eye lesions and stuff like that, patients will get blurry vision when they're trying to read or focus on something. Okay, yeah, so here it is. Kidney, sympathetic only, and fat cells don't have parasympathetic action either. So again, same as the sympathetic, know these target organs, the ones that are important: heart, lungs, sex organs, eye, bladder probably. Oh. And this is just a kind of previous to the last, or similar to the last slide, but more detailed. I know it might be kind of a pain, but you'll thank me later. I want you guys to know each of the types of ganglion and where they supply and what cranial nerve they're associated with. So the three, right? There's number 3, 7, 9, and 10. You gotta know that. So 3, don't really worry too much about these names of the nuclei, but more focus over here. So we have preganglionic neuron, the cell body in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, leaves synapsing in the ciliary ganglion, postganglionic information going to the circular muscle to constrict the pupil, ciliary muscle to allow for accommodation near vision. And just as a point here about the parasympathetic information, it travels, don't think of it as a separate physical nerve, because all the information is just going to travel in the same nerve bundle. So it's going to travel, inside the nerves that are going to the eye. Next, we have the pterygopalatine ganglion, and I want you to know that that's associated with cranial nerve 7, and the submandibular ganglion is also associated with cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. The pterygopalatine ganglion is responsible for the lacrimal and nasal glands. Submandibular ganglion is responsible for the submandibular and sublingual glands. And remember, it's parasympathetic and rest and digest. First step of chemical digestion is, salivary amylase, for example. And when the body senses there's food in your mouth, there's the stimulating of salivation. And the otic ganglion is associated with cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it innervates the parotid gland. I want you guys to mainly focus on the difference between 7 and 9, because that can be confusing when you get to next year. You'll think 7 innervates the parotid gland because it travels through the parotid gland, but it does not. Cranial nerve 9 is parasympathetic innervation of the parotid gland. And then cranial nerve 10 does like everything else. I mean, all these organs is vagus. It's also called the wanderer because it wanders all throughout the body. The S2 through S4, they're also called the pelvic splanchnic nerves, and they provide parasympathetic innervation to the large intestine, urinary bladder, and male genitalia. Something of interest here, right about here in the colon, because for the digestive system, right, start in the stomach, small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, ileum. Ileum is here, then you get to the ascending colon and transverse colon. Right here is really important. After the proximal 2/3 of the transverse colon is something called the splenic flexure, and that's where a division occurs between blood vessel supply and innervation. So it's vagus nerve all the way up, basically the whole digestive tract all the way up to here, and then after that, in the descending colon and down, this pelvic splanchnic nerves take over innervation. And if you ever forget where these nerves travel, you'll learn the blood supply in detail in anatomy, and they almost always travel with the blood supply and have the same name a lot of times. So this is a table talking about the different types of receptors that participate in the parasympathetic nervous system. I'll put a dividing line here. So acetylcholine is always the thing that binds, but it can bind nicotinic or muscarinic. When you think nicotinic, think skeletal muscle and autonomic ganglia. And you might think, what? But remember all the pre-ganglionic neurons, they all secrete acetylcholine, and all of the acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors. And nicotinic receptors are a great example of ligand-gated ion channels, because in order for these ion channels to open, a ligand has to bind, in this case acetylcholine. So that's a good example of the information we talked about last week. Now muscarinic receptors, we'll talk about this next, are G protein coupled receptors. So instead of there being a membrane ion channel that opens when acetylcholine binds, there is an intracellular signaling cascade that usually goes one of three ways in the G protein pathway. And then the end result is something like a change in cyclic AMP or calcium levels. But I will talk about this next time. Just know M1, CNS, M2, heart, M3, glands, and smooth muscle. I'm recording. Hold on one sec.